everyone knows super suits are important. After all, without his gadgets, Bruce Wayne would be just a billionaire instead of a billionaire who also fights crime. Okay, maybe that's not a great example, but Captain America's true power doesn't depend on his armor, but rather the Super Soldier Serum coursing through his veins. Let's talk about if it may be wearing off at the worst possible time in the history of the MCU, during Avengers Endgame. Even within the confines of the MCU, we've seen what can happen when the Super Soldier Serum doesn't work quite right. Just take a look at the Red Skull. Now, that's a face only a mother could love. Okay, maybe not even then. The slightly off Super Soldier Serum caused Johann Schmidt to look as horrible on the outside as his personality is on the inside. But the Army hopeful Steve Rogers got a more carefully constructed dose which helped him become the Captain America we all know and love today. That Super Soldier Serum has been coursing through his veins for decades now, and although it started out working great, he's the only long-term case study in existence. If you think about it, can the serum wear off or stop working? Are there any long-term effects associated with using it? They say if something seems too good to be true, it usually is, and in the comic books, that's often the case with the Super Soldier Serum. Marvel Comics contains a precedent for just about every horrible thing imaginable happening to our heroes, and this is no exception. Just imagine a substance that can give you superpowers and turn you into a physically perfect human being, and imagine the side effects it must come with. We know the MCU is a fictional place, but come on. Even we can't suspend our disbelief that much. Captain America 438 is just one example of the serum backfiring terribly on Steve Rogers. In the comic, we see Captain America facing off against Red Skull, as he so often does when something goes terribly wrong. His body starts to freeze up and he finds himself growing paralyzed. All of those years benefiting from the Super Soldier Serum were catching up, and his body had reached its physical limits. It was only a matter of time before the Super Soldier Serum caused his body to completely shut down, and even Steve Rogers can't survive that. In order to combat the paralysis, Steve turned to his friend Tony Stark, who hooked him up with some swanky Stark technology and a brand new exoskeleton. It looked pretty similar to his usual costume. However, Captain America couldn't be too excited about his fancy new costume because his body was still slowly dying. And the more he jumped around, threw his shield and engaged in general heroics, the faster his body would deteriorate. Thankfully, he managed to survive after desperate action was taken. The Super Soldier Serum was flushed from his body, where it had bonded with his blood. There are some other complicated plot points here involving Red Skull and clones, but we won't get into that. The important takeaway was that the Super Soldier Serum has permanently changed the genetic makeup of Steve Rogers. This was also addressed in Captain America 378, which involved a similar blood transfusion. In Captain America Volume 7, number 21, we see Steve Rogers fighting against the villainous Iron Male. Although he emerges victorious, Iron Male manages to drain the Super Soldier Serum from his body. Not only does this render Steve Rogers powerless, but it also turns him into an old man. The serum that allows Captain America to fight crime also keeps him young, which is a pretty nifty side effect. With the serum removed, Steve Rogers looks his age, and Sam Wilson ends up taking on the mantle of Captain America instead. So the answer to could the Super Soldier Serum wear off is a bit complicated. It doesn't seem to wear off in a traditional sense, but it can definitely be manipulated or rendered inactive by outside forces. It can also just go terribly wrong over time, which isn't really any better than it just ceasing to work. What makes us think it could be about that time for things to go terribly wrong for Steve Rogers? Well, besides just being in the endgame now, as Doctor Strange would put it, there are a few reasons. The first is that Steve Rogers has been Captain America for quite some time now. The MCU likes to try to keep things open-ended when it comes to labeling specific dates. Yeah, we noticed Peter Parker's birth year was missing on his passport in the Far From Home trailer, but we know Steve Rogers was injected with a Super Soldier Serum during World War II, so we'll conservatively say it's been at least 70 years since then in the current MCU. And even though Steve Rogers was frozen for most of that time, his body was still working. Sure, it was slowed down due to the cold, but his heart was still pumping that Super Soldier Serum-enriched blood through his veins. Otherwise, he wouldn't have survived, and the ending of Captain America the First Avenger would have been much grimmer. Now, let's talk about what Steve Rogers has been up to since being unfrozen. He's hung out with actual gods, gotten precariously close to Infinity Stones, and that's just in the lead-up to Avengers Endgame. While we aren't sure exactly what's going to go down in Endgame, we can make some educated guesses. Most people assume Steve Rogers is going to end up traveling through time and venturing through the quantum realm. There's no telling what effects these things could have on even the standard-issue human body, let alone one that comes with a Super Soldier Serum option. Like we said earlier, Steve Rogers is currently the longest-running case study on the long-term effects of the serum. We're guessing Professor Erskine didn't exactly exactly have the chance to run tests in the quantum realm when he was trying to put his fantastical concoction together. Nobody really knows what effect it could have on the serum, least of all Steve himself. It's hard to say much about the quantum realm of the MCU, and we're not just saying that because we aren't exactly Hank Pym here. It's a complex and confusing place at best, and Marvel Studios is probably trying to keep certain things open-ended so they have more possibilities for future stories. During Ant-Man and the Wasp, we learned that Janet Van Dyne had managed to survive her long stint in the quantum realm. However, she states this place changes you, and it's established that time and space work very differently there, to say the least. It's likely her body had to adapt and change during her time in the quantum realm, and if Steve spends enough time passing through, his could too. We know that a regular human can survive, but what about a superhuman? That's totally uncharted territory, and Steve Rogers would likely have no idea what he's walking into. We've also been warned about the dangers of time travel from Wong during Doctor Strange. The topic gets him pretty fired up, and not just because Strange interrupted his Beyoncé listening time. He claims there's a price to be paid for using something as powerful as the Time Stone, and messing with the space-time continuum. We don't know what the price is or who's going to have to pay it, but there's a distinct possibility it could end up being Captain America. During the Super Bowl trailer for Avengers Endgame, we saw Steve Rogers seemingly taking part in a support group for those who are struggling to deal with the decimation. We've also spotted him shedding a few tears and generally acting as one might expect after an event that wiped out half the world's population. But one moment gave us pause, and that was when Steve was seemingly struggling to put on his shield. This antiquated shield attachment method seems to reinforce the idea that Steve is going to be traveling through time at some point. As we all know, Steve said goodbye to his old shield at the end of Captain America: Civil War. After he failed to play nicely with his friend Tony Stark, he had to give up his favorite toy. However, Tony did hook him up with a sweet old phone so he could stay in touch, and during Spider-Man: Homecoming, we heard Happy Hogan list a prototype Captain America shield as one of the items to be moved from Stark Tower. So we're guessing Steve probably feels okay about getting to use the shield at this point in Endgame. What's with the tremors he seems to be experiencing when he equips the shield? Well, he could be experiencing a deluge of emotions which are having a physical impact on him, or he could be going through a physical reaction to the Super Soldier Serum. Captain America has been in the MCU for a long time. Heck, he was the first Avenger. As we get ready to move into Marvel's Phase 4, there's no doubt things are being shaken up. We have the X-Men and the Fantastic Four, plus all of their associated characters available to be incorporated into the MCU following Disney's acquisition of Fox. This leads many fans to believe that some of the heroes who've been around for a while might not survive Avengers Endgame. Actor Chris Evans has said in the past that he'd rather stop playing Steve Rogers while he's still popular, instead of waiting until people are sick of him. He also tweeted that playing the role for over 8 years has been an honor, and that he's thankful for all the memories he's made along the way. It certainly sounds like he may be getting ready to move on from the role of Captain America. If Captain America isn't going to survive Avengers Endgame, well, we're no Doctor Strange, but we can probably think of at least 14 million ways he could perish during that movie. That being said, there'd be something almost poetic about him meeting his end because of the very thing that made him a superhero in the first place. It's easy to forget when we see Captain America laying the smackdown on the bad guys that there was a time when the standard armed forces didn't want him. He was rejected from the army during wartime, which has to be a blow to the old self-esteem. But despite not being physically strong, Steve Rogers has the good, virtuous, sometimes irritatingly moral fortitude of a superhero. That's why Professor Erskine chose him to receive the Super Soldier Serum in the first place. It really goes back to the whole conundrum of what makes a hero, which is a common theme in the MCU. During Spider-Man: Homecoming, Peter Parker proved he's just as willing to fight crime in a pair of sweats as he is in a high-tech suit from Tony Stark. Whether or not Steve Rogers is enhanced with anything, he's willing to fight for what's right, despite the odds. Of course, if his Super Soldier Serum is going to start to fail, the Endgame is pretty much the worst time possible. With everything else going on, will our heroes have the resources to help Steve? Especially if Tony's still stuck in outer space. And would Steve even risk asking for help while everyone is trying desperately to defeat Thanos and undo the decimation? The idea of losing Captain America for good is heartbreaking. Even people who don't really read the comic books or watch the movies feel nostalgic about Captain America. But is it time for him to move on? During the trailer, we also saw him looking at an old photograph of Peggy Carter, showing that she's still on his mind. Steve Rogers may have gotten to eat Thai food and watch Star Wars, but he essentially left his entire life behind when he accepted the Super Soldier Serum. And it seems like the only way to really be rid of the serum is for Steve to perish, as sad as that may be. What do you think the long-term effects of the Super Soldier Serum may be? Could Steve Rogers' handsome face end up looking like the Red Skull? Or could something even worse happen? Let us know what you think in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to CBR for more MCU videos. Thanks for watching.